My name is Amanda Pfeiffer. I'm an education coordinator at the Canadian Light Source. We're here with one of our newer employees to the Canadian Light Source in our series where we're recording different staff members of the facility. Before we get started though, I would like to acknowledge that the Canadian Light Source, which is in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, is located on Treaty 6 land in the traditional territories of the Nahuatl, Anishinaabe, Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis. And as educators and staff members, we respect Indigenous ways of knowing and oral traditions. And we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in a spirit of partnership, reconciliation, and collaboration. So, Al, I'm going to get you to introduce yourself and tell us what you do at the facility.
Hi, I'm Rahemtulla. I'm an associate scientist at the CLS working under the Brockhouse sector, which is one of the newer beamlines at the CLS. So basically what I do is run a series or help assist users who come in to do experiments, run their specialized measurements, taking into account the special needs of whatever either their samples or the techniques that they want to do. And also in conjunction, we're working to improve the beamline and develop new and better techniques.
Cool. So when did you start at the CLS?
I started in February 2020, so I got about a month and a little bit in of normal work experience before COVID happened and everything shifted in an odd way.
Yeah, I can imagine. So how does that look like now working from home and as a support scientist, because a lot of what you need to do is at the facility?
So at least when beam's on, it means I'm spending a lot more time on the beamline because obviously because of pandemic conditions, users can't come on site to do experiments. So normally what would happen is these users who are usually professors and graduate students doing research for their master's or PhD theses come in, they have a few days to a week of beam time, and they're pulling round the clock hours to get in as much data as they can because time on a synchrotron is very valuable. Now with the shift, usually expectations have to be tempered a bit and all those measurements are now being done by the associate support scientists on the beamline. So it means we have to, the nice thing is that we get to organize our time a bit better so we can group a lot of similar experiments together and do things in batches. So at least on, we have 3 beamlines at Brockhouse. I've spent a lot of time, at least with user experiments, on our high energy beamline, which we just call SOE2, which is just the CLS coded name for the hutch that we're in. So there's a we can do high energy powder X-ray diffraction, where we have atoms scattering off of the planes formed of atoms and looking at the rings that form. That tells us a lot about the crystalline and atomic structure. We can also go a bit deeper and do something called a pair distribution function measurement, where including those Bragg plane reflections, we look at a lot of the stuff that happens in between those reflections, which occur, and by doing some fancy math or Fourier transforms of that data, what we actually get is a real space distribution of how atoms are distributed in what we just shot X-rays at. And while those setups are very similar, they usually require different energies, different distances of detectors, new calibrations. So one of the nice advantages is that we can do all our PDF measurements, or pair distribution function measurements in one go, all our lower energy measurements in one go. If people are doing things, sometimes we need very sample conditions. So things like keeping samples at a certain temperature, either very cold or very hot. We've varied things from 80 Kelvin, which is minus 190 Celsius, I think.
I won't contradict you. I'm sure it is good.
And we've done measurements up to 1,000 degrees Celsius. So there's a big range there, and those usually require very different setups. So being able to batch has helped a lot. But we've also had some experiments where a lot of things happen at once, and occasionally you get a lot of those crazy hours.
Yeah. That's really interesting to hear. A lot of the users for the education programs obviously get access to the ideas Beamline, which is just a completely different setup. So hearing the setup that goes into Brockhouse, and even in that, like you said, there's three different Beamlines. So knowing that like each Beamline is unique and how and what that actually means is pretty valuable. So building off of that, so what kind of, for people that don't know, what kind of applications does the Brockhouse and some of the techniques that you talked about? Like, what are some of the research experiments done there?
So I'll list off a few because there's probably more than I've been exposed to just yet. Um, at SOE2, we've done a fair bit of work on batteries. We got our first publication from some work that I managed to actually start off on,
Cool.
looking at the scattering of a battery while it's in operation over time. So we can see things like degradation of the electrolyte layers that go between the batteries, which will help in research and development of better and higher capacity batteries. We've also done measurements on many different steels, which of course have applications in a lot of metallurgy and engineering applications. From there's a lot of just principal science investigations of novel materials. So we've done some work involving usually glass. So, and this is the work that got me involved in Brockhouse to begin with, was getting very detailed measurements of glass, which is very different from crystalline materials because glass actually doesn't have an ordered structure. The atoms are all amorphous, which means there's no long-range pattern to it, whereas with something like a diamond, the atoms form this very nice tetrahedron, and that continues out into a large space. So you actually don't get those sharp Bragg reflections, but you can still do pair distribution function measurements of those. And what's very interesting is that in a lot of cases, there's actually very strong short-range order, which means the atom, the nearest neighbor and second nearest neighbor distances of atoms in these glass materials are very well defined. It's just when you go beyond that, things get very difficult to ascertain. So that was actually a lot of my research that I did in grad school before I started over here, and I did some experiments at Brockhouse before I ended up joining the team.
Oh, that's really cool. Building off of that, I guess. So, what was your career path to getting to the CLS? You mentioned grad studies.
Yeah, so at least I'd say probably going back to middle school, I had an inkling for physics. I really liked understanding how things work, and I still remember the first thing is learning about like levers and ramps and simple machines, and then you start getting to high school kinematics, and you start seeing the interplay of that in math, and I started getting the sense of, oh, there's a lot of things that happen that you could actually model and describe, and that got really interesting. So, and then also, like most kids, it was really interested in space and things like that. So I started off in university, and honestly, I thought probably very theoretical or astrophysics was sort of the path that I was trending towards, but because I really wasn't interested in biology all that much, and at least starting up in university, actually, I didn't have the best chemistry profs, and so I never really did much chemistry beyond first year, and because I never thought, oh, that's not something that really interests me. Like I really like the hard math and stuff of things, but as I went along, I did a bit of AstroWorks in my undergrad senior project. I did work trying to model gravitational waves of black hole simulations, and it was interesting, but I found it didn't really spark anything for me. And then I met my advisor, who just talked about doing a whole bunch of different measurements and all the information you get by shooting X-rays at things. And I'm like, oh, that sounds interesting. I'll give it a try. And from there, I just pulled me down this rabbit hole, and I started getting the experimental inkling more and more. And then now I'm working at an experimental facility.
Crazy how those things happen.
Yeah.
I could say the same. For me, it was the biology classes. I only needed a couple to get my degree, and then here I am working at a facility where biology is like very helpful to know. So it's crazy how much those moments happen where you don't think you need something, and you find out that yeah, it's a part of your job.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially in what I do where I'm working with X-rays and working with area detectors, a lot of the detectors that we use come from medical applications because, well, yeah, because I guess the medical industry has a lot more money in R&D, and you can make a lot more products because a lot of hospitals and places need detectors. So what it means is that you can either get a very specialized detector designed for X-ray synchrotrons, and they cost a lot of money. They're very good at what they do, but they cost a lot of money because the market for it's very small. Or you take the hit and you lose maybe some of the perks you get of a specialized detector, and you go with a medical detector, which is designed to work in the same energy range that we're doing our experiments in. And now you're paying so much less for it, and you get something that can do a lot more. Yeah, and it's funny actually. Probably going in, the thing I realized coming out of grad school was, I think it wasn't very popular at the time, but medical physics is probably something that's very interesting, very popular field now, and there's so much overlap with what we do, with what I do and what I've learned.
Absolutely, yeah. So thinking even further back, you talked about some of your high school classes. So in your position now, like what would you need from high school if you were to go back? Like what classes would you need that would help you with your position today?
So probably the most important thing and probably the only subject that I use almost regularly is everything from trig.
Yeah.
There is, especially with X-ray diffraction, where we're looking at angles of things deflecting, we have a giant apparatus called a diffractometer that's basically designed to spin something at a whole bunch of different series of angles. And working out those angles becomes very important. We have to mount detectors in interesting ways, especially in some of the experiments that I've done both as a grad student and also now as a scientist doing experiments for my old advisor. And mounting a heavy detector at, say, a 30-degree angle, where you only have a couple screws that you have to get post position for, suddenly requires a lot of knowledge of trig and working out angles and positions, so that way you can get that right, so that way you don't have a bunch of people holding onto like a 75-pound detector in the middle of a table while you realize none of the things that you made fit, which can still happen sometimes.
Yep, that's true. So thinking about when you started at the CLS, I know it was only for a month before the pandemic hit, but like, what was your first impressions of, well, I guess you would have been here so when you did your grad studies research, so you can talk about that time too, but what was your first impressions of the facility, or even as you started to get into the details of working here?
Probably the first impression was how big the place is and how much is going on. I think especially because I haven't spent a lot much normal time at the CLS. There hasn't been a lot of time for me to really explore the other beamlines nearly as much. Actually, funny enough, I spent a summer at CLS, which also happened in the summer of 2018, where another incident happened. So
Yep.
I haven't had the best luck, but when things work, they've worked very well. When I started working, I basically hit the ground running. It was jumping in and immediately getting into user assistance. And I think part of having time spent as being a user on my end and being well aware of the stress and the hours and how important it is to have things working and ready to go, because there's going to be usually something else that goes wrong during an experiment. Uh, I was sort of able to really jump right in, and it almost felt surreal being on the other side of it, where you're able to do a lot of the interesting work without nearly as much of that stress and pressure of doing a lot of important work in a very short period of time.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you like when you talk about that, like how you were a user first and then you become the associate scientist, so you know how to better support that experience. So I could see that working out for you, which I mean, obviously, because you're at the CLS as an employee. So talking about stress, so how do you, what do you find now stressful about your position and how do you cope with it?
I'd say at least with I think a lot of the uncertainty that's popped up now which is mostly COVID, has really probably been the biggest source of stress. We've seen things can change pretty quickly in terms of how we do our work and being ready to adapt for that. But on the most part, things haven't been very stressful work-wise. Really, it's been where at least doing experiments for doing maybe more intense experiments that would normally be done with users on site, and at least attempting to do that in COVID times is probably been the most stressful, and that's mostly because it's throwing me right back into that user mindset with less of the downtime that follows when you do an experiment. But coping has just mainly been trying to maintain that work-life balance. I'd say usually trying to, at least before COVID, it was trying to go out and do social things outside of the workplace, which
Yeah.
happened a lot less now. But there's been a lot of virtual meetings and hangouts that definitely alleviate the stress.
Yeah, definitely. That's still very important, whether it's, you know, in the pandemic or whenever it gets back to normal times. But I guess when we actually get back to normal times, that's going to be different for you because it'll be your first time actually experiencing it without any issues and any pandemics or restrictions.
Yeah, it's been a year now. I still feel like I'm very new at the workplace, just because at this point, I think I've still spent more time away from the CLS than I have on site.
Yeah. And then like you said too, like even with all the beam lines, like so I've been here for a couple years now and like obviously you don't know everything within 2 years, but you still continue to learn stuff, like learning more about Brockhouse and the different beam lines. And yeah, it never ends, which is a good thing. I love learning and I get the sense that you do too. So it's a good facility to be at then.
Absolutely.
So with that, what do you enjoy about your position?
I really like having a variety of experiments that happens and that learning opportunity that comes with it. Like I spent a fair bit of time in university between undergrad and grad school, and part of it was because I really enjoyed that experience. I loved being able to learn things. I love and then in grad school, I love that independent learning and being able to do research and try to solve problems. And it got rid of the thing I didn't enjoy as much about grad school, which was being hyper focused on one problem uh, with the deadline of I have to solve this to get my degree. Now I can kind of learn about a bunch of things without any of that pressure. And especially when users come in and I get to learn about specifically why some of their samples and these measurements are important to them. And it's very interesting, and it just really opens up that world of research.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have like a favorite experience so far?
Um, that's definitely hard to say. I think I'd say the most memorable experiences so far have probably been the few crazy, intense experiments that I've done where things have worked.
Mhm.
Is very satisfying, and it's at least knowing that in that time there was a lot of stress, there's a lot of pressure, and you're just doing your best to get through it. And then you find out, like, as the analysis starts to come in, that, oh, things actually worked out really well. And it's like, oh, it's a fantastic feeling.
Definitely. Very relieving, I can imagine too. Random question, but what was your first job that you can recall?
So I'd say this is my first like career job.
Hmm.
So I got hired on as I was writing my PhD thesis.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a bit of period where I was juggling that. My thesis was written, thankfully, so it was just coordinating
Ooh, that's
my
good.
defense, uh, which got a lot trickier with COVID.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Uh, but from there, I was like back in high school. I was working warehouse jobs and yeah, nothing very interesting. And then towards the end of undergrad, it was doing some like summer research positions, which is what pulled me into material science.
Hmm, that makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting when you think about, those first positions, and a lot of it, like, it's not that it directly relates, but you can take some of those soft skills or some of that experience, and then like you said, you get into like more tailored positions like those research ones. I know CLS obviously has a lot of summer positions, but if I recall, a lot of the positions at the U of S do offer opportunities like that too. And that's really good to get that
Hmm.
experience when you're young, and then you find yourself working at a research facility. So, okay. So, if you had any advice to give to high school students, what in this as they are searching for their career or maybe their first job, what advice would you give them?
In terms of finding at least a career path, is be very open-minded. There's a lot of things I wrote off early in high school, and for the most part, I was convinced that it was fine. Things like, yeah, I really wasn't interested in biology. I didn't like memorizing a whole bunch of different things. I liked understanding how things worked, and it didn't really do much for me. And then, at least going now, a lot of bio and medical research is fascinating, especially with that overlap in physics. Programming and coding is
Mm, yeah.
probably it is it is the biggest asset to have. Part of what got me on board was because I was fluent and had experience, not just coding, but also, fortunately, I had experience actually working with a lot of the software that's used on diffractometers on X-ray beamlines. So I came in with some of that experience as well, which was a big asset. So having a wide variety of sort of coding solutions in your tool belt makes you very versatile. And there's a lot of things, especially now, that you can automate that used to be a job in of itself.
Hmm. That is a really good point about the coding experience. Because yeah, so much of our world and like world outside of CLS is has coding somewhere in its production line, whether that's front end or back end. So that's a really good point, and hopefully students kind of take on to that. I know a lot of the schools and curriculums are now incorporating that into their classes at the high school level. So, but that's good to think of, and especially if you're unsure of where you're going, having a whole bunch of variety of knowledge is going to help make you more advantageous, I guess, to future employers. So, well, I guess with that, we'll end it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet and share your experience at the CLS. And yeah, hopefully it continues to get better and we get back to normal. And yeah, you can get to experience CLS in a normal year, although I'm not sure what that is either. Every year that I've been here has been completely different too. So
Yeah.
oh.
I mean, I'm mostly excited for the return, hopefully the return of Jazz Fest.
Yes, all the festivals in the summer.
Yeah.
Saskatoon is pretty good for their festivals, so.
Yeah, I thankfully did get a taste of that back in 2018.
Oh,
so
that's good.
yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, with that.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks.